So yesterday I was having a conversation with this guy, and I wanted him to know that I feel God's presence. And so I told him that I feel accompanied by a thing, and that I feel a connection to a higher power. And then I immediately said, I don't even know what the hell that term really means. It's kind of a bullshit term, I said. But hey, it's for a bullshit concept, so that's okay. And I never really thought much about that since. This was yesterday. But right now I'm quite proud of myself for saying that it was a bullshit term, higher power. It is meaningless, isn't it? All right, let's read this chapter because we're going to understand. Okay. The mind thinks in embodied metaphors. Simone Schanall, or Simone Schanall, director, Cambridge Embodied Cognition and Emotion Laboratory, University Lecturer, Department of Social and Developmental Psychology, Cambridge, UK. And of course, this is another essay from this book. Philosophers and psychologists grappled with a fundamental question for quite some time. How does the brain derive meaning? If thoughts consist of the manipulation of abstract symbols, just as computers process zeros and ones, then how are such abstract symbols translated into meaningful cognitive representations? This so-called symbol grounding problem has now been largely overcome, because many findings from cognitive science suggest that the brain does not translate incoming information into abstract symbols in the first place. Instead, sensory and perceptual inputs from everyday experience are taken in their modality-specific form, and they provide the building blocks of thoughts. British empiricists such as Locke and Berkeley long ago recognized that cognition is inherently perceptual. But following the cognitive revolution in the 1950s, psychology treated the computer as the most appropriate model to study the mind. Now we know that a brain does not work like a computer. Its job is not to store and process information. Instead, its job is to drive and control the actions of the brain's large appendage, the body. A new revolution is taking shape, considered by some to bring an end to cognitivism and ushering in a transformed kind of cognitive science, namely an embodied cognitive science. The basic claim is that the mind thinks in embodied metaphors. Early proponents of this idea were linguists such as George Lakoff, and in recent years, social psychologists have been conducting the relevant experiments, providing compelling evidence. But it does not stop there. There's also a reverse pathway. Because thinking is for doing, many bodily processes feed back into the mind to drive action. Okay, consider the following recent findings that relate to the basic spatial concept of verticality. Because moving around in space is a common physical experience, concepts such as up or down are immediately meaningful relative to one's own body. The concrete experience of verticality serves as a perfect scaffold for comprehending abstract concepts such as morality. Virtue is up, whereas depravity is down. Good people are high-minded and upstanding citizens, whereas bad people are underhanded and the low life of society. Recent research by Brian Meyer, Martin Selbum, and Dustin Wigant illustrated that research participants are faster to categorize moral words when presented in up location and immoral words when presented in a down location. Thus, people intuitively relate the moral domain to verticality. However, Meyer and colleagues also found that people who do not recognize moral norms, namely psychopaths, fail to show this effect. People not only think of all things good and moral as up, but they also think of God as up and the devil as down. Further, those in power are conceptualized as being high up relative to those over whom they hover and exert control, as shown by Thomas Schubert. He wrote, "Your Highness, vertical positions as perceptual symbols of power. All the empirical evidence suggests that there is indeed a conceptual dimension that leads up, both literally and metaphorically. This vertical dimension that pulls the mind up to considering what higher power there might be is deeply rooted in the basic physical experience of verticality." Verticality, oh, that's where I stopped. So now we're reading together. Verticality not only influences people's representation of what is good, moral, and divine, but movement through space along the vertical dimension can even change their moral actions. That's exciting. Lawrence Sana, Edward Chang, Paul Micheli, and Christian Lundberg recently demonstrated that manipulating people's location along the vertical dimension can turn them into more high-minded and upstanding citizens. They found that people in a shopping mall who had just moved up an escalator were more likely to contribute to a charity donation box than people who had moved down on the escalator. Similarly, research participants who had watched a film depicting a view from high above, namely flying over clouds seen from an airplane window, subsequently showed more cooperative behavior than participants who had watched a more ordinary and less elevating view from a car window. Thus, being physically elevated induced people to act on higher moral values. The growing recognition that embodied metaphors provide a common language of the mind has led to fundamentally different ways of studying how people think. For example, under the assumption that the mind functions like a computer, psychologists hope to figure out how people think by observing how they play chess or memorize lists of random words. From an embodied perspective, it is evident that such scientific attempts are doomed to fail. It is increasingly clear that cognitive operations of any creature, including humans, have to solve certain adaptive challenges of the physical environment. In the process, embodied metaphors are the building blocks of perception, cognition, and action. It doesn't get much more simple and elegant than that. That was the last sentence. It doesn't get much more simple and elegant than that. That's awesome. That's something I don't really think about. That, one thing that, okay, so let me clarify something. So I often compare us to computers. And that's just to say that we are a series of programs. Now, the goal of the programs and the way that the programs sort of function is different. But no, we are like computers in the sense of like, in just the sense of that our code has been sort of written, and it's constantly like changing based on our environment and this different stimuli. But it's a code and that follows certain steps. Of course, it's parallel, unlike a computer or unlike most computers. So you'll have activity stimulated here and here. Actually, I don't really know what that means when people say that computers don't have parallel. All right, anyway. But no, we are not like a computer in the sense that the coding, the programming is not about in order to store and process information. I would have said it's about, surviving. But no, this is so much better. Well, that's what I always say. It was just about survival, not about finding truths, processing information, whatever. But actually, no, yeah, it's about our brain evolved. Its job is not to store or process information. Instead, its job is to drive and control the actions of the brain's large appendage, the body. Now, of course, in a way that will get it to survive, ideally. But yeah, that's like an important step to the thinking about it, is that of course there has to be a lot of physicality. Everything is or not everything, but most things we should expect to be in terms of physicality. All right, well, I haven't fully, some of my voices are processing this. Other voices are not yet influenced as they should be by this. So I'll just keep thinking about it. But that's pretty cool.